Thanks for joining me for another edition of Writing Notes. Today we're going to learn a bit about logical fallacies. Now, this is actually a really tough video. This is actually a really tough video to figure out how to structure because there's a ton of logical fallacies. There's all different kinds of them. So, without turning this into like an hour-long lecture about logical fallacies, I'm going to give you guys some basic components of it, and then I'd encourage you to go out and seek additional information about specific logical fallacies. So, broadly speaking, what are logical fallacies? Well, logical fallacies are styles of argument or structures of argument that look convincing, but they're actually not reliable. So there's something about the argument, there's something about the logic behind it that doesn't actually prove the argument. That's not to say that the argument is incorrect. An argument may still be fundamentally correct even if it's supported with logical fallacies, but you can't rely on logical fallacies in order to make a case in an argument. So, for instance, okay, so we'll go through it this way. I'll give you a brief sort of explanation of what we have here in Joining Academic Conversations, the English 102 workbook here at WVU. So this book breaks up logical fallacies into three different categories. We have fallacies of relevance, which are fallacies based on a shared trait that they are logically irrelevant arguments. We have fallacies of presumption, ambiguity, and grammatical analogy. So these are not a result of irrelevant premises, but arise because they presume what they set out to prove. This is actually a pretty big one. And then we have fallacies in ordinary language. And it says here, these can be the most difficult to identify. That's actually true, partially because they get used the most. These fallacies are grouped together based on their common usage and the need to look more closely to recognize them. So I'll talk specifically about a few of these. The thing I would say about logical fallacies is that they're tricky little fellows because they often look like sound arguments, they often look like logical arguments, and they often look reliable, but they're not. And so what you need to do is figure out how to determine whether or not an argument being made is valid. So a couple of the ones to look for. And a lot of these that I'm going to point out here have relevance in contemporary politics. Politicians use logical fallacies all the time. And it's not necessarily that they're bad arguers or that they're bad rhetoricians or even that they're bad people. Logical fallacies often work until you start getting services like factcheck.org, which say, well, that's not really how it is, kind of thing. So, we've got things like, this is a popular one right now, appeal to the people, argument ad populum. And this is one that sounds very democratic. And you hear politicians using this all the time. The people want this, or I'm doing this for the people. The thing is that there's a difference between what the people want and what's a good policy. So, I mean, for instance, there was a point in time at which segregation was what a large portion of the population wanted, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was the best decision. So, we've got, here's another fun one. This one happens all the time. Argument ad hominem, which is argument against the person. This is not necessarily so much in politics, but this is something that a lot of people do in sort of interpersonal relationships. This is where you attack a person's character or attack a person's beliefs, their lifestyle, their values, whatever it is, rather than disagreeing with their argument. This is a really common one. got, okay, begging the question is one that does happen. This is a pretty frequent one. Petitio principii is the Latin for this one. And basically, begging the question is where you assume that the thing that you're trying to argue for is obvious. Well, everybody knows that, whatever it is. Well, everybody knows that legalizing marijuana would decrease the number of drug arrests every year and is therefore a good decision. Whatever it is, if you're in favor of legalizing marijuana. Whatever kind of argument you make, if you have, I mean, and that's the way that begging the question often works, is you get this sort of, well, everyone knows, or it's obvious that, I barely need to say this, but I'm going to. You often get these kind of introductory clauses like that. Equivocation is a pretty big one in politics, and this is using words, because I mean one of the things about the English language is that a lot of words have more than one meaning. So equivocation is where you use a word to mean different things in different contexts, but pretend that you're using them to mean the same thing. So we get a lot of words that get used in different ways. Words like freedom, words like liberal, conservative, things like this. They get used in different ways, even within the same context, the same speech, whatever it is, and this becomes a problem. This is one of the really big ones, actually. It's the false dichotomy, or the either-or. So this is where you talk about a choice as though there are only two possible options. So either you vote Democrat or you vote Republican, for instance. This, of course, sort of ignores the fact that we've got the Green Party, socialists, American Nazis, Marijuana Reform Party. I don't know why I'm on marijuana for this video, but I mean, there are all these third parties that you could conceptually vote for, but the way that the election is set up, the way that elections in this country are set up, is this false dichotomy of either Democrat or Republican. Either you're pro-choice or you're pro-life. You're pro-gun control or you're anti-gun control. And so we have all of these debates that should really be much more complex than they are, but they get oversimplified in this way. We have the slippery slope. This is another really common one among politicians today. Basically, the slippery slope is, if this thing happens, there will be dire consequences. Or if this thing doesn't happen, there will be dire consequences. So, if the federal minimum wage is raised to $10.10 an hour, businesses across the country are going to shut down and the economy is going to collapse. The reason this doesn't work is because it's not the most likely scenario if the thing that is threatened to happen happens. So, regardless of what your opinion of raising the federal minimum wage is, it's not going to be economically catastrophic. And then here's the other one that I wanted to tell you guys about briefly in this video, which is the straw man. Again, the straw man is a really common argument, particularly when you're trying to argue against a specific opponent, or against a generic opponent. So, for instance, liberals believe this thing. I don't know, liberals believe that all babies should be aborted, or whatever it is. That's a really easy argument to argue against, but it doesn't actually represent the views of most of the people who identify as liberals. So basically what a straw man is you set up an argument that is really easy to contradict and is really easy to take apart, but it's also not a fair representation of what the other side believes. So, I don't know, conservatives believe that all babies should be issued AK-47s right out of the womb. No one would actually make that argument, hopefully. No one would actually make that argument, but it's a really easy argument to say, look how crazy and ridiculous they are. Everything that they believe is stupid and wrong. Once you have to actually deal with a sort of nuanced position, it becomes much harder to argue against it. And so people oversimplify the other side's arguments in order to try and make it easier for them, that is for the person who's arguing against that position, to take that other side apart. So this is basically how logical fallacies work. Because again, they're things that look like sound arguments, look like reasonable positions, but they're not. There's some component of them that's missing, whether that's reliable premises, whether that's a fair comparison, whether that's playing language games and things like this. There's something about them that doesn't work. Thanks for watching.